First known generation, my great-great-great-grandparents. Details are few. I don't know their names. I don't know their parents' names. I don't know if they had siblings. I don't know when they died. I do know that my great-great-grandfather was born somewhere in Africa, and my great-great-great-grandmother was born in the state of Georgia. I believe that both were born around 1815, about 196 years after the first Africans were brought to Virginia, and about 21 years after Eli Whitney patents his cotton gin. My great-great-great-grandparents were brought 60 miles south of Montgomery, Alabama to Butler County and had at least 3 boys, Dick, Reese, and Jack, between 1835 and 1840. Records indicate the likelihood that other siblings existed. Growing up, my grandmother told me that a white family by the name of Thigpen owned us. I haven't found relatives by that name, but have found family members by the name of Powell, Peagler, Gregory, and Bowen. I believe we got our name from descendants of Charles Bowen of Jones County, Georgia. I suspect that the Bowens follow Revolutionary War soldier John Carter and his family to Butler County just shortly after Bowen's daughter Martha marries John Carter's middle son Jarrett in 1818. Martha and Jarrett died in 1843 and 1845. My grandmother's stories and those of the Bowen and Carter's families overlap when Martha and Jarrett's daughter Martha marries Elijah T. Thigpen in Butler County, December 20th, 1855. To give you a better sense of the situation, in 1850 there were 3,204,313 registered slaves and 434,495 free blacks in all of the United States. In the state of Alabama, there were 342,844 slaves, of which black belt counties like Butler averaged around 7,000. At the same time, there were 4 free blacks in Butler County. A decade later, in 1860, that number would rise to 44. Second generation, my great-great-grandparents. Details are more abundant here, though most of what I have are only names and dates. Presumed to be the oldest, Dick Bowen was born around 1835, a year after Great Britain would abolish the slave trade. I believe he lived and died in Butler County. Little is known of presumed third child, Jack Bowen. His name was found in a family Bible owned by descendant Doris Peagler. Jack was born enslaved around 1840 and died free before 1910. I believe he was survived by wife Jane. Jack and Jane had 4 children, Lula, Frank, and twins Martha and Mary. Twin daughter Mary wed Joe George, and together they had 10 children. Their 9th child, Eva, had 2 known daughters, Doris Peagler and Sarah Powell, born in Butler County in the early 1940s. Doris and Sarah's family has lived and worked on what used to be John Carter's youngest son Alfred's land for several generations, first as slaves, then as sharecroppers. The Carter family lost the land in the Civil War, and since then, the acreage has been owned by the family of slaveholding planter Harry Poole, deceased 1997, of Pine Flat, Butler County. Sarah and her husband live in the Greenville area. In 1969, the year I was born, their 8th child, Eric, would be the first family member born off the Carter Poole plantation, some 106 years after Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Dick and Jack's brother Reese, my great-great-grandfather, was born around the same time that runaway slave and novelist Harriet Jacobs would go into hiding in 1835. He lived most of his life with wife Scytha in Butler Springs until her death. At the age of 76, great-great-grandpa Reese moves to Greenville and marries second wife Callie Goldsmith in 1911. I have no additional information about great-great-grandpa beyond this date. I assume that he dies in Greenville sometime before 1925. His first wife, Scytha, my great-great-grandmother, was born in Alabama in 1852, the same year that Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. She married Reese in 1863 at the age of 11 and had 9 children. She died in Butler Springs sometime between 1900 and 1910. Born into slavery, it's hard to say what my great-great-grandma would have known about the world taking shape around her. In her lifetime, Frederick Douglass would write My Bondage, My Freedom. The U.S. Supreme Court would hand down the Dred Scott decision, Blacks from California would settle in British Columbia. Abolitionist John Brown would be hung for leading an attack at Harper's Ferry, and the Civil War would begin in 1861. Reese and Scytha's first son, Gus, would be born in Butler Springs in 1864. In 1865, the war ended, slavery was banned, and Lincoln was assassinated. In 1867, the British North America Act passed, and John A. Macdonald would become Canada's first prime minister. Reese and Scytha's daughter, Mittie, would be born around 1869. In that year, Louis Riel would lead the Red River Rebellion, and Manitoba would become Canada's fifth province. In 1870, daughter Minta would be born. In 1871, British Columbia joined the Confederation. Daughter Alice was born in 1872, son Johnny in 1874, and in 1875, Reese and Scytha's sixth child, Missy, would be born. Mark Twain would write The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in 1876, and the Exodusters would begin their migration from Kansas in 1878. In 1879, son Ed would be born. In 1882, Texas cowboy John Ware, the famous black cowboy, would move to Alberta, and in 1883, Reese and Scytha's youngest son, Augustus, would be born. The last spike was driven for the CPR, and Louis Riel was hanged for high treason in 1885. In 1887, the Dawes Act was invoked, and in 1889, Vincent van Gogh would paint his famous Starry Night. Details about the lives of Reese and Scytha's children are scarce. Minta Bowen Lucas was a divorced mother of 5 children and caretaker of widowed father Reese by 1910. Reese and Scytha's son Ed and his wife Lizzie Lucas migrate to Freestone, Texas around 1905. Together they have 4 children, Thelma, Fred, Hubbard, and Ed Jr. Ed Jr. marries Bessie Lee Carroll. Together they have 6 children, including Kennard Bowen. Kennard wed Mary Louise Turner in 1966 and has 2 children, Camilla Bridget and Kennard Jr., who would then go on to have Jonathan and Ashley with his wife, Cherie Hunter. Third generation, my great-grandparents. My great-grandfather is Reese and Scytha's 5th child. Early census records list him as Johnny, but I know him as Willis Bowen Sr. I know little of his life in Butler County, except that he was born in 1874 and married wife Jeannie in his father's house in 1893. Some have said that he left Butler County because he had killed or nearly killed a man after an argument at a dance sometime around 1901. Great-grandma Jeannie was half black and half Cherokee. She was born in Wilcox County, Alabama in 1875. Her maiden name was thought to have been Thigpen, but discovery of her marriage license shows that her family name was actually Gregory. I have no details about her parents, nor do I have any clues about how they came together. The family myth is that great-grandma was the daughter of a chief, which might be true, though the likely scenario is that great-grandma's father had enslaved her mother, as the Cherokee Nation is known to have kept black slaves then. Together, my great-grandparents Willis and Jeannie had 13 children. Siblings Mary, Ivy, Willa, Reese, and Bodie were born between 1894 and 1900. The family settled 650 miles west in Freestone, Texas, with great-grandpa's brother Ed and his family around 1901. There they had daughter Magdalene and son Jeffrey between 1902 and 1903, though Magdalene would become ill and would not survive the year. The family kept moving to what was then Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Not yet a state and free of Jim Crow laws, the territory was a haven for blacks who hoped to create and govern their own lives. In 1904, the family settled around Clearview, a black town 70 miles south of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Son John Henry was born there in 1905, just a year after Saskatchewan and Alberta became provinces of Canada. Willis and Jeannie's 9th and 10th children, Obadiah and Elreen, were born in Clearview as well, around 1907 and 1909. The family thrived in Oklahoma. The children got good educations, and the family owned their own land. In-laws Albert and Mary Gregory and cousin Columbus Bowen, his wife Martha, and their 8 children were doing well there too. But the climate changed when Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. Segregation laws were put in place soon after statehood, and relations between blacks and whites eroded. Around the same time, the Canadian government had been encouraging settlement of the West with the promise of free or cheap land. Scouts from Clearview were sent to Canada as Oklahoma repealed voting rights and segregated the schools. An exodus from Clearview began soon after. Some families joined a movement to return to Africa. Others opted to settle 120 miles north of Edmonton, Alberta, in Athabasca Landing around 1909. My great-grandpa Willis left for Canada from Guthrie, Oklahoma with our family, a few bachelors, and 4 other families, about 40 in total, in a chartered rail car in the summer of 1910. The Canadian government had not anticipated the rush of black immigrants and quickly adopted entry restrictions in an effort to keep them from coming in. In 1911, a white mob would rape a black woman and lynch her and her son as they awaited his trial for a shooting some 30 miles from Clearview in nearby Payton. At the same time, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier drafted a regulation that banned blacks from coming into Canada. Less than a year later, the order in council would be repealed because Laurier's government was defeated in the general election. The trip from Alabama to Canada was especially hard on great-grandma Jeanie. She had suffered a stroke before leaving Oklahoma at the age of 34 and had never fully recovered. One of each family member in the chartered rail car was turned away for health reasons after inspection in White Rock, BC. Immigration rejected the Bowen family because middle boy John Henry had a broken leg. The family had no choice but to wait for the leg to heal in Bellingham. When it did, great-grandpa Willis decided to take John Henry across separately through a different entry point. The rest of the family crossed at White Rock and continued on to Vancouver without issue. In July 1912, Willis and Jeanie's 11th child, Edward Hubert Bowen, would be born in Vancouver. The First World War had just begun. Raised on the farm, great-grandma Jeanie had no interest in the city. She hated Vancouver because it always rained and she didn't trust a place that had an ocean on one side and mountains on the other. She blamed the loss of her 12th child on Canadian doctors, believing that the child would have been saved if the family was around black people. So, the family moved to Amber Valley, Alberta, a black settlement near Athabasca Landing, not long after. Eldest daughter, Mary, was stricken with meningitis along the way, so the family stayed at a public stopping house. Mary recovered, but the family contracted body lice and their belongings burned to the ground in Athabasca. Great-grandpa Willis was given $125 in compensation for thousands of dollars of household belongings because he couldn't prove its value. With virtually nothing, the family lived in an abandoned house until great-grandpa Willis built his own, 6 miles from the post office, 3 miles from the country store, and approximately 4,100 from Butler County. In 1915, Willis and Jeanie's 12th child, Purvis Kitchener, aka PK, was born in Donnetville, Alberta. Great-grandpa Willis was hauling freight to Fort McMurray when his 13th and final child, my grandmother, Jean, was born February 27, 1919, 3 months before the general strike shut down Winnipeg, and 2 years before hundreds of blacks would be killed in the race riots in Tulsa. The Bowen children were an integral part of the Amber Valley community in the early years. The older children began to marry within the community, while the younger attended school. Their ailing mother, Jeanie Gregory Bowen, died, some say crazy, on April 27, 1932, in Amber Valley. She was 57 years old. 6 years after her passing, youngest daughter Jean married Albert Sterling Risby of neighboring black settlement Campsie on June 15, 1938. Great-grandpa Willis continued to work the farm and was the first postmaster of Amber Valley through 1942. He returned to the States once in 1943 when he tried to convince brother Ed to come to Canada. Ed decided to stay in Freestone, Texas with his family, who continue to live on the land to this present day. The brothers stayed in contact by writing each other regularly until it was no longer possible to do so. Their grandchildren, Kennard and Norma Jean, wrote on their behalf until their deaths in the 1970s. Mama and Daddy, that's what I call my grandmother Jean and my grandfather Albert, spent the early part of their lives together in Amber Valley. Jean and Albert's first 3 daughters, Eldith, Leora, my mother, and Ardith, were born on the farm as the Second World War played out. 7 children followed between the years 1946 and 1957, including Wayne, Donna, Verna, Ross, Carmen, Barbara, and Danny. Mama and Daddy thought that their kids would get a better education in the city, so they sent the older ones to Vancouver to live with great-grandma Rose Risby in the early 1950s. Great-grandma Rose took ill around the same time, so the rest of the family moved from the farm to live together in Vancouver's East End. Daddy worked as a porter for the CN then, and Mama worked for her nephew at Vancouver's only black nightclub, the Harlem Nocturne, on Hastings Street. In 1955, my mother, Leora, was 13 years old and had started grade 7 at an integrated school when the Montgomery bus boycott began in Alabama. She graduated from high school in 1961, and though Vancouver was as hostile as the States for blacks, she was working for the city of Vancouver when the March on Washington took place in 1963. She was working at the University of Washington in Seattle when the marches on Selma began in 1965, and was back in Vancouver in 1968 when Martin Luther King was shot. My mother met my father, Lamar Zach Smalley, in Seattle at the Checkmate on 23rd, not long after King's assassination. About a year later, I would be born in Oakland, California, 6 months after Apollo 11 landed on the moon. My parents married in April 1972 and were separated by 1973 when my father's unresolved first marriage was brought to light. In that same year, Shirley Chisholm would announce her candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States, and the Watergate scandal would break. A year later, Pierre Trudeau would be reelected as Prime Minister of Canada, and less than a year after that, my great-grandfather Willis Bowen Sr. would die in Amber Valley, Alberta, October 21st, 1975. He was 101 years old. I was 6. My mother lived between Seattle and Vancouver throughout much of the 70s and 80s. Mom and Daddy raised me in the times that I didn't live with her. When my mom did live in Vancouver, we would go to Seattle on weekends to visit her sister Eldith and her kids. I remember watching Roots there in 1977 with all of them. When I lived with Mama and Daddy, I went to Bible camp in Newbrook, Alberta, and Friday night tea meetings at Great Aunt Lena's Church in Vancouver on East 22nd. I sang hymns with Daddy in church and grew up around a lot of old people I didn't understand. As a result, my childhood is marked by the passing of Mama and Daddy's many church friends, brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews, and nieces. Between the years 1970 and 1991, my grandmother's siblings Reese, Bodie, John Henry, PK, Willa, and Edward would pass, as would my grandfather's siblings, Frank and Herman. I remember when, in 1979, my grandparents' fourth daughter, Donna, died on Hastings Street. I remember when their son, Carmen, followed in 1982, when eldest son, Wayne, died in 1990. Jean and Albert's youngest daughter and my favorite aunt, Barbara, passed more recently in 2003. There were 75 seventh-generation and 10 eighth-generation descendants born to the Bowen family by the time I finished high school in 1987. As of today, I know of 653 Bowen family members in total. Mama and Daddy moved back to Alberta and started preaching again when Daddy was given his own church in Edmonton in the late 1980s. I changed my last name to Bowen to honor my grandmother in 1991 and graduated from Art College in Vancouver in 1992. Jean Bowen Risby died of a heart attack in Edmonton in 1993. Reverend Albert Sterling Risby died in Vancouver 6 months later. My name is Deanna Jean Bowen. I moved to Toronto shortly after their deaths and have lived here since August 1994. This project began in 1996. What happened between then and now is another story.